All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday, December 9th of 2021, a vintage NBA DFS slate last night, down to the final game on the slate, getting relatively slate-breaking news coming out. Quite a slate last night. Definitely one where you would have been getting familiar with the late swap tool, probably early and often into this slate, but definitely creates some edge there. I had some lineups that were absolutely crushing it with a 1% owned Nasir Little in the later part of the slate there that I was starting to get really excited about. And then, of course, he got hurt right after halftime and left for the rest of the game. Was a bit bummed out after that, but legitimately some late news chaos there on the NBA front. We've got 3 games on tap tonight for NBA. We've got NFL Showdown. We've got a big hockey slate. Quite a few questions in my queue today. Some topics that I think definitely are fitting after last night. We'll talk a little bit about some late swap stuff, some late swap strategy. We'll talk definitely a fair bit about ownership projections. There are a lot of questions about ownership here in the queue. Definitely some things that I want to talk about there. Variety of other questions here. It looks like looking ahead to football, some questions about setting stacking rules for football. We've got questions about how custom projections affect the Sims, managing your player pool, all kinds of stuff. So a busy day here on stream, but we'll start diving into some things here. So again, we'll always try to answer questions in roughly chronological order as best I can. So go ahead and start asking your questions now. Get them into the queue. Pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack or the YouTube chat, and we'll get into this. So I'm going to dive us right in here and talk about ownership because we've got a question from Ryan that came in here yesterday, about an hour into the slate. And Ryan said, hey, will SaberSim be more accurate with ownership projections soon? Example on Harden tonight. It was obvious he was going to be highly owned, but the projections weren't even close. Getting away from some ownership plays is so important some nights. Thanks. And I will start this question off by saying the same thing that I pretty much say every single time an ownership question comes up, is that we know that the ownership projections are not perfect. We have spent some time, we've actually spent a lot of time leading up to the NFL and the NBA season this year, improving them. And I think they have come a long way. But there are limitations to the ownership model. And it is a great spot to add value. And I want to just kind of explain like a little bit more of what these limitations are, or like because the way we project ownership is really, frankly, quite a bit different than anything else that is out there. And it allows us to do some cool things like potentially see where the field might go on certain plays with ownership that somebody making ownership by hand might not. It allows us to project ownership for every single slate, every single game out there, and it allows us to regenerate ownership basically more or less instantly when news breaks. But what the ownership model is doing is it is taking an aggregate projection and it is building thousands of lineups at a high variance setting, basically mimicking the slate, and then the exposure to certain players in those sets of lineups becomes the ownership projection. It is building real lineups that the field might build, and then saying how often a certain player shows up is how often that player is going to be owned in the contest. Now, this is an algorithm. This is a computer making this determination. And I feel like last night is just picture perfect. I could not write a better situation to highlight probably the biggest overall limitation, the number one biggest overall limitation that a model that projects ownership this way is going to be, and that is narratives, right? Last night, we have James Harden returning to Houston, and we have Kevin Durant out, which the Kevin Durant thing out is going to affect James Harden's projection. But if the narrative of how much that affects his projection is far outweighing what it actually does, which frequently happens with stud players, the field is going to over-roster players. Now, when you ask the model, who are going to be the highest owned plays on the slate, or how are the most expensive players on the slate going to be rostered, you see something like this. You see we have all of these highest projected owned plays on the slate. James Harden is probably on FanDuel. This is where the big discrepancy was. On DraftKings, we were actually pretty much there. We were right on with the ownership projection, but on FanDuel, we were not. We'll talk about a little bit about why. But this is what's going on here, right? So you're asking the model, you say, how's the field going to navigate the highest projected plays on the slate? Who is it going to use? And that model comes back and says, well, they're going to like James Harden the most. He's the best projected point per dollar play here. But it's not anything extreme. He's probably not one of the chalkiest. Well, he is, but he's not like the top overall chalkiest play on the slate, right? We go over to DraftKings. Let's look at DraftKings from yesterday. And he is. And we actually nailed this almost exactly right? So why this discrepancy, right? Like why not on FanDuel? What's the difference there? Well, we can kind of start piecing together the story. First of all, on DraftKings, James Harden projects as the best overall play on the slate, just by a bit over Jokic, but he is the best overall play on the slate. And his difference in his point per dollar value is actually quite a bit higher than the other plays that you can afford to kind of spend salary on. He projects actually point per dollar quite a bit better than the top overall plays on the slate. But really, I think the thing that really dials it in here, and again, because the ownership projections are coming from actual lineups, right? This is really kind of the key here, is if we look at the best overall projected plays on the slate, look at what shows up on DraftKings. Power forward, center, power forward, center, center, power forward, forward, small forward, forward, power forward, center, small forward, forward, right? Then we get then a point guard here. Point guard, guard, shooting guard, point guard, guard, right? Let's go look at FanDuel again. And go see what we see here, right? What are the best value plays on the slate? What are the best point per dollar plays on the slate? Okay, so again, center, power forward, shooting guard, small forward, right? Remember, James Harden is point guard, shooting guard eligible. Point guard, shooting guard, small forward, shooting guard, small forward, point guard, right? The point guard and shooting guard position at FanDuel, regardless of what the field proceeded to do, and regardless of whether or not that was right or wrong, was a lot more competitive from a projection standpoint. And that's what the builder picked up on. The builder said, Harden's projection is what it is. His pricing is what it is on these two sites. But on FanDuel, he's competing at the point guard and shooting guard position with guys like Karis LeVert, Dennis Smith, Derek Jones, Norman Powell, Bruce Brown, in a way that he isn't really in the same way on DraftKings. So he's going to be 50. A rational field is going to roster him 54% of the time on DraftKings and 18% of the time on FanDuel. And that's not what we got, because we had a narrative that James Harden was going back to Houston. And I actually think the fact that he ended up equally owned on both sites is just perfectly clear, just perfectly shows that this was a narrative-driven thing. He's going back to Houston. Kevin Durant's out. He's going to go off, right? We even had it a little bit with Stephen Curry last night too, who was playing in this. What did he have to do last night? It was like, if he hits 16 threes, he breaks the all-time record. And like, there was this, I don't know, it sounded like there was a soundbite or something of him teasing that he was going to try to do it tonight, right? Another play where he didn't project all that well, but had much higher ownership than expected, right? So this original comment from Ryan here says, it was obvious that he was going to be highly owned. And maybe it was. It wasn't for me, to be honest. I wouldn't have expected the 55% ownership we got on Harden on FanDuel, personally. I expected him to be highly owned. I didn't expect that, right? But if it was obvious, it is because we are humans and we can see that narrative and we're just there. We pick up on it, right? These are the situations where I am always saying that you can really add so much value by just making an adjustment there. And it doesn't have to be on every single player on the slate. But if you see that and it doesn't look right to you, just bump it. And anything is an improvement, right? If you have the sense, again, this isn't even something that I had the sense. Like this wasn't something I did last night. Because as I was researching the slate, I was seeing the things I just walked through. Oh, guard is rather a little bit competitive on FanDuel. There's actually a lot of diverse lineup constructions you can do on FanDuel. On DraftKings, all the values at point guard, center, at forward and center, like people are going to jam hard like crazy, right? but it was different between the two sites. But if you saw this coming, you're like, this Harden narrative is out of control. Everyone's going to jam him in. They're not even going to care what his projection is. Going back to Houston with no Durant playing, like he's going to be this highly owned. It doesn't even you don't even have to be that right? Or you could have been, I mean, this would have been an improvement, right? So all of this to say, like, our goal is to get more accurate here, right? That is our goal. But our vision for what this product is something that doesn't leak biases into the process like this, which means there are always going to be some limitations to the ownership model, no matter how accurate we get. And one of them is going to be that it is not necessarily going to pick up on steam and narratives and plays that are just getting touted. And like yesterday was the perfect example of it. And if you are seeing that, it's just a great spot to make an adjustment. Because the model kind of did what it was asked to do yesterday. And I know that sounds silly because it obviously missed on this projection on James Harden, but it missed because of basically because of a market inefficiency, right? That the field reacted to a bias there. So anyway, I'm going to leave that one there. I don't want to just keep repeating myself, but I mean, again, like we will continue to try to improve the ownership model. But with that said, when you can pick up on narratives and things that are easy for humans to see, make an adjustment. So anyway, I'm going to keep it going for now. And I'm actually going to jump back. I think I missed this one. This one had come in right before that question came in yesterday. Quicker one here. This one says, should I adjust unique players for NBA or leave at 1? Or do I adjust each as needed? And what is the leverage used for? So we'll answer these two rather quickly here. So the min uniques column, right? What it does is the number of unique players when comparing any two lineups in the pool to each other, right? So when set at 1, each lineup has to have at least one player different. That means it's a unique lineup. If it was 2, each lineup needs to have 2 players different. This is a blunt tool, a blunt object, basically to force diversity, to force differentiation in your lineups. I always leave it at 1, to be completely honest. I've never changed it. I think the Sim Variance slider does a fine job, does a better job, really, actually, of making your lineups appropriately diversified for the contest you're playing. But if you want to force a level of diversity into your lineups, I think you can adjust this here. That's basically what it is for. The leverage column in the post-build process is a calculation that compares your exposure to a player to the projected ownership to show you how over or under the field you are, right? What percentage of lineups in your portfolio, more or less than the field, include a certain player. So ultimately, what it ends up meaning is it means the highest positive leverage players in your lineup portfolio here are the players that you are rooting for, the players that you stand to gain the most from when they do well, given that the ownership projections are correct, basically inaccurate, right? So, and vice versa, right? The negative leverage plays are the players that your lineups stand to benefit the most when those players fail, or vice versa, stand to hurt you the most if they were to succeed, right? If the ownership projections were hyper accurate, completely accurate, right? If they were actual ownerships, there is no player that could stand to hurt your overall ROI last night, theoretically, more than Jaren Jackson. There's no player you could stand to benefit from more than Dennis Smith. Even though I think this was a player, yeah, Dennis Smith's projection changed while late swapping, so his actual ownership was obviously quite a bit higher than this, but that is how the leverage column is used. So, okay, cool. So going to jump here to a question from David here, and I think the easiest thing would be, well, let's see. I'm not going to copy this whole question, but we'll copy part of this to make this as straightforward as possible. So David was running into an error, and I'm sure probably many of you saw this error yesterday, that basically says that the issue says we can't rebuild 2 lineups with your settings when he's trying to late swap, right? So he's trying to late swap some lineups, gets a message saying some of your lineups can't be late swapped. And the message says, would you like us to clear your settings and attempt to rebuild them? And if you click yes, what happens there is that we remove all of your exposures that are set, and we attempt to rebuild your lineups, right? We're basically saying we can't meet these exposures anymore. Too many players are locked into the lineups. There's not enough positional flexibility or salary flexibility. This will happen more often at the end of the night. Can we remove those settings that you put in and rebuild? And you say yes, and you might get stuck in a loop, right? Now, the loop there is not a good user experience. That's not what we want long-term. But what is happening there, and what probably happened here is with the Paul George news breaking last night, is that there's some other restriction on your lineups that are preventing the lineups from being rebuilt. And they typically fall into a couple different buckets. So the most common one is that when you are late swapping, there's a minimum salary where the builder cannot find a player that can fit into the lineup to replace a player that is out while also fitting this min salary rule. So Paul George is a good example. If you had a lineup last night where only Paul George was left to play and he got ruled out, and your min salary was set at 500 less than the maximum, there literally was not another player in the pool that could just one-to-one fit into Paul George's spot and fit in there, right? Another one is stacking rules, right? You may have, if you have a stacking rule that says, for example, no more than 2 players per team, but the only way a lineup can be swapped after news has broken and it's the last game of the night or something like that requires 3 players on the team, right? That can interfere. Another one that can interfere is the minimum projection rule, right? Let's say, for example, that you have a certain player that is in your lineup, right? And the only player that can now replace him is projected for 14 points, right? Well, that player functionally isn't in the pool, so we can't swap him in because of this filter rule, right? And then finally, probably the last one that's most commonly going to interfere is min uniques. These are the 4 things that I typically recommend checking for if you're getting this message, is min uniques, right? There may be a player that can swap in, but that makes that lineup only have 1 player unique from some other lineup in the pool, making it a move that the builder can't do. So long-term, we want to make that clear all settings a little bit more robust and reset all of these things so that the lineups can just build themselves. But in the event that you are seeing the message saying, we can't rebuild your settings or we can't rebuild your lineups because of settings, right? And you're getting stuck in a loop there. Those are the 4 things to check. So what I would literally recommend you go do this. I would say turn min salary down to 0, right? Especially last game of the night, you're just trying to get a player that's been marked out like Paul George. It doesn't matter. Most of your salary is already used. Turn this to 0. Turn this back to 1 if you've changed it. Delete any stacking rules you have. At this point, again, your lineups are 90% complete anyway. You're just trying to make the swap. And then lastly, just either set this filter to just 0, to just say only include players that are projected for more than 0, or just remove the filter completely. And I would say 99% of the time, the builder's going to work at that point. There may be situations still when there is literally not a player that can be swapped in. If there's a team that has significant injury concerns and maybe there is literally the only possible play that you could have possibly played in a small forward position is the guy you had in there and now he's out, right? That does happen sometimes. You can get stuck like that with the last lineup, the last game of the night. But I would say 99% of the time, clearing those things out will allow the builder to process your build and fix everything. So, but good question. And I apologize. I know that is definitely frustrating and probably stressful when you are minutes before lock, but that is the best advice I can give there. So, oh yeah, David's here. So he said, thanks. I didn't even think about the step 1 filter. Yeah. And I think the most common issue is the min salary most of the time. But those are kind of the four things that possibly could interfere. So, would quick swap have worked? I think so, but I'm not positive. I think so. I'm not actually entirely sure if quick swap. No, yeah, I think so, because quick swap doesn't follow the build settings that are in this page. So quick swap likely would have worked. And that can be a good alternative too if you're just really in a pinch, is to just accept the late swap, click no when it asks you if you want to rebuild, and then just quick swap the last 2 lineups where the guy is out. That probably would have worked as well. So, okay, cool. Question from Toasted Taters. Let's jump back to the ownership discussion. This one's a little bit of kind of a different question. He said, any update coming in the future for ownership? But this time, it would be nice to see an option in step 1 to input your contest selection size, like in step 3, and then have player ownerships adjust accordingly to the contest size / selection. Yeah, this is an interesting idea. We've talked about this a little bit as something we'd like to do, especially because this is theoretically almost exactly what our approach to ownership should be able to do and should excel at, right? Like, if we have an understanding of how spread out different lineup constructions tend to be in the Millie Maker, and an understanding of how much lower variance lineups people build in a single entry, right? We should theoretically be able to build ownership for different contest types. The problem is it is a little bit higher stakes, right? Because ownership does tend to condense, but it condenses on the field. It condenses on the field's like aggregate agreed upon best plays. And if you identify those incorrectly, you are going to like potentially just make it even worse. If you're off on a player, if your ownership projection is off on a player when you're projecting large field, right? It's probably going to be very off on a player if you're projecting smaller field, right? Like if we said, if our approach to last night's slate was literally that the most popular shooting guards were going to be Tyler Hero, Karis LeVert on FanDuel, and then James Harden, right? And then we said, okay, now let's project single entry, let's project smaller field stuff. It's likely that the builder would have condensed even more onto Hero and LeVert, where obviously the most popular play at the position was James Harden, right? So it's a little bit higher stakes in that way. But it is something that we've talked about that we would like to do, is identify those ownerships a little bit more on a per contest level. But it's hard, you know. The thing with the ownership is that like it is not always a contest is not going to be a perfectly efficient market when it comes down to ownership, right? But the way in which it's going to be inefficient is somewhat non-predictable. Not unpredictable, somewhat non-predictable, right? You are dealing with this big pool of diverse participants, like a very diverse group of participants of very efficient players and very inefficient players, and trying to make a prediction about what these people are going to do. But like predicting irrationality is hard. It's almost impossible. How are you going to predict what somebody that is not following like a logical set of rules is going to do when given a set of choices? So that's kind of going back to the ownership thing here. That's part of why it's hard. So predicting, I guess, like where, I don't know. I a little bit lost my train of thought there. Yeah. It's the point here, I guess I'm trying to make, is that this is something we've talked about. I think it'd be really cool. I think it's something that from a technical level we should be able to do. But it's tricky for the same reasons that predicting ownership is hard anyway, and it's higher stakes. You are doubling down essentially on your takes there. So, but anyway, let's keep it rolling. I see some questions coming in live. I promise we will get to everything. Going to finish the questions here that came in before the start of my stream. This one is from Jared, and I think it's basically the same issue that David was having. Jared says, last night I did late swap 5 minutes before lock to switch out Paul George. And when I was doing lineup recap this morning, Paul George was still in my lineups. Can you explain why that may happen? So yeah, Jared, I assume you are running probably into the same issue David was, where there were lineups that because of salary restrictions or potentially stacking or min uniques or minimum projection restrictions, Paul George could not be removed from the lineup. He couldn't be removed from the lineup without breaking one of the rules. So I would check out that question that I just answered if by chance you missed it. And next time, if you're running into that issue, honestly, really, if you're late swapping the last game of the night, one thing that you can just do preemptively is just turn min salary down to 0. That will fix a lot of these. So And again, we want to automate that. But for now, you can just do that manually and it will should be resolved. So Kobe asks a question here that it's possible we're butting up against a bug here. But he says, why does SaberSim add players back in you don't want? They always add 3 and 4K players back in to complete a lineup. Can you show how to take them out of the pool permanently? I feel like I lose so many big hits because they don't score or start. So, I mean, if you know that for a fact you don't want a player in your lineup whatsoever, you just do not want them, the easiest thing to do is to just uncheck them here in step 1, right? So, you know, I mean, you could do this with a baseline of saying, maybe you increase this a little bit and say, don't give me any players that are projected for less than 18, right? Don't give me any of those low projected players. But maybe you're also looking at the low end of salaries and maybe you're removing some other guys that are down here, right? Maybe some lower projected, I don't know, whatever you want to do with this. But if you remove them from here, they literally cannot show up in your build, right? They will be in 0% of your lineups. So if you go in here and then now build, and let's change this back to something that makes a little bit more sense, right? We're going to build a pool of 500. We won't get any of those guys in the lineup, right? I don't know, Kobe, exactly what your process looks like. So I'm answering this question just kind of from what I think might be happening here. But so again, we'll have 0% of those players showing up in the lineups, right? But if you are, for example, right, like you know, let's say you are going in and cherry picking lineups, right? And you're saying, okay, I don't want any lineups with Norman Powell in them. So you're going through and you're removing a bunch. Okay, so we have a ton of Norman Powell apparently, but you're going through and you're removing Norman Powell lineups, right? And you're doing this like hand picking approach. And then you go in and fill back up to 20. You can refill those lineups with other Norman Powell lineups, right? Those lineups can be filled back in. Now, if you do it over here and you just say uncheck Norman Powell, right, we won't refill with Powell lineups at that point, so you shouldn't get any from him there. But it can happen if you're doing it by cherry picking individual lineups or anything like that. So, I mean, I don't know exactly what your process looks like, Kobe. It is possible that you've found a bug here. So I would say in the future, if you know there are players that you 100% do not want in your pool whatsoever, I do not want these guys, just remove them in step 1. That is the easiest way to make sure they don't show up in your lineups. And if somehow you remove them in step 1 and you get a build where they show up in the lineups anyway, copy the build URL, which is this up here. So when you're in a build, it is what is in your address bar, and send it in the support channel in Slack and let us know what happened and we'll take a look, because that would 100% be a bug. But if you remove a player in step 1, they should not show up in the lineup. They're not even in the pool. They cannot. So, but I apologize that you're having trouble there. I can see how that would be frustrating, especially if you were trying to get things done quickly right before lock. So, all right, question from T here. And he said, if I were to upload my own data, will new Sims be run off my numbers, or will SaberSim only use its own data to run Sims? I see my projections in my lineup and pool. I'm wondering if Sims were run based off my numbers or if they were just put in lineups where it mathematically makes sense. Thanks. Yeah, good question. So when you upload custom projections, whether you upload them or just change your projections, right? Let's go to today. Enough of yesterday. Let's go to today's games. Okay. So if you made updates to projections, right? Maybe you think that you like Jokic a little more than we do and we bump him up, right? The simulations of the games don't rerun when you adjust projections. They run once. Max is in chat trolling me today. Anyway, the simulations don't rerun when you upload custom projections. What happens is that we take the existing simulations and we take the difference between your custom projection and our mean projection. So in this case, 3 points. And we increase Jokic's projection, for example, in this case, in every single game simulation we have for that player by the difference. So by 3 points in this case. The effect of that is shifting the distribution of that player's range of outcomes 3 points to the right. But the sims have already been run. They are not changed. They are not rerun when you update projections. So Let's see here. Making sure I answered this question here fully. Yeah. So you still get all the value of the real range of outcomes and the proper distribution curve of a player's outcomes, but they've been moved slightly up or down based on what your projections actually envision that player's mean is, essentially. So Max says, if you wear glasses when building, do you make smarter lineups? If last week has been an indication, maybe. I've been running hot ever since I've been wearing the glasses. So I have a LASIK consultation on Tuesday of next week, and I was told I can't wear my contacts for 2 weeks here. So I've been glasses only, which has been kind of rough for me. I have terrible eyesight. I have like no peripheral vision now, and these things are heavy. I don't know. Maybe you guys can see them, but they're thick. So, but maybe it's made me a better DFS player. So if you've been struggling so far this NBA season, you probably need a pair of glasses. So thanks for tuning into Office Hours. That'll be it for today. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, let's keep it rolling. One more question from Toasted Taters here. This is the last one that's in Slack, and then we'll get to these questions that have come in YouTube chat here. But Toasted Tater says, when doing NFL showdowns, if the lineups build lineups based off game sims, would it be beneficial to remove players in step 3 rather than step 1 so that it removes that game sim of the players you don't want? That is, if you remove players in step 1, the sims will still use the same game sim, but add a different player in place of the one you took out, if I'm understanding correctly. Very sharp. Yes, I agree. I think you are right. What Toasted Taters is basically saying here is, let's look at the game tonight, for example, and let's do it on DraftKings because I refuse to play FanDuel's single game product. Okay, so let's look at a game sim, right? Let's look at a lineup, basically. So we look at this here, and we'll just take the very first lineup. Yeah, and this is something that's come up before. I think Shady Advice is probably the first one that kind of put me onto this here. I think it's especially true in these situations where we're using single game simulations. But this is a risk here of the individual. This is a risk of potentially removing players in step 1 for contests like this, right? For example, right? Let's see. So we've got this first lineup here, and this lineup has a game sim that is supporting it, right? There's a simulation. We're using single game simulations to build all of these lineups. Sim Variance is at 10. There's a simulation represented by this lineup, or a set of simulations, actually, where this lineup is optimal. And in fact, given that it is the 100 Saber score lineup, it is actually probably the most frequently appearing optimal lineup in our simulations, right? Now, if you had removed Deontay Johnson from your lineup pool because you just wanted to fade him, for example, it is possible or even likely that you might have gotten the same lineup, but the next highest scoring player that fit in was Alexander Madison. So Alexander Madison took Deontay Johnson's spot. But in reality, that lineup where Deontay Johnson is 1-to-1 flipped for Madison is not necessarily the optimal for this actual game simulation. It might be optimal for a different game simulation. In fact, it might be in our pool, but it isn't actually now the optimal for the game sim in question here. And you can force the builder to do things where it is actually using a different player than it should because of a restriction on the player pool. Right. And I think this is minor. I would not panic about this by any means. I think player pool curation in step 1 can still be a good thing, especially if you're very opinionated about the players you want in your pool when you're building lineups. But this is, I think, a good point, and all else being equal, probably makes sense to do more of this kind of thing in step 3. Like if we now uncheck Deontay Johnson and just say we don't want any of him, the builder is going to filter through other lineups that are optimals for different game simulations and just give us the best 20 where you have 0% Deontay Johnson, right? As opposed to building a lineup that is less optimal for its individual game sim that it is built for because of a restriction on the player pool. So yeah, that I think especially for Showdown, I think that's pretty valid. pretty sharp because we're just talking about a single game. We're literally talking about optimals for that single game. As soon as you leave the realm of showdown and you're talking about more than one game, or if you leave the realm of Sim Variance 10 and you're talking about more than one sim, at that point, I don't think it really matters as much, to be honest. I really don't. And at that point, actually, it's probably even better for you to do your player pool curation in step 1 so that the pool of 500 or 1,500 lineups you get in step 3 is more representative of what you wanted to do. And you're not just left with the leftovers of your pool, right? Like if we were on, let's go back to the NBA slate tonight, right? If you knew, for example, that you wanted to lock Jokic and play 0% Westbrook or Jaren Jackson Jr., just as an example, right? Let's actually keep these shown so we can see them, right? So like you're making some stands here. If we built 500 lineups for the purposes of finding 20, but then locked Jokic and removed Westbrook and Jaren Jackson Jr., and then especially if we then proceeded to make more exposure adjustments, right? We may be just left with whatever the leftovers of that pool of 500 are that fit those exposures. While those lineups are viable for the contest, they may not have been the best ones we could have gotten, right? In this particular case, it might make sense to do more of this in step 1 so that you build a pool of 500 lineups that is more representative of so that the 20 lineups that come out of that 500 are truly the best that include Jokic and don't have Westbrook and Jaren Jackson, right? So, but I do think for a showdown specifically, single game where the sim variance is 10 and we're actually literally talking about optimals, I think it makes sense. So, good question. Sweet. Let's keep it going. All right. That is it for the questions that were in Office Hours channel in Slack. Jack says, using the stack tool, trying to run a QB +2 with one run back. When I do, I'm getting a lot of lineups other than 2+1s. I know you said in a recent Office Hours video to max the exposure of 2+1 lineups, but if I do that, I'm still getting other lineups. Can you help me with just getting QB +2+1? Okay, yeah. So 2 ways to do this, really. Let's go and look at this. So option 1 is to do this in the exposures, right? To not set any kind of rules and to just handle this in step 3, right? And I think this would probably be most useful, especially if you were open to having more flexibility, right? Maybe you weren't completely locked into just building exclusively QB +2 ones, right? But we can do this with the stack types column in step 3. So we'll give this a second to build some lineups, maybe get to see how the slate's looking for Sunday. I think we're still over projecting Nick Boyle, unfortunately, working on getting that fixed, especially with the Thursday to Monday slate locking tonight. But let's see. Let's take a look. So, all right. Cool. So yeah, as I mentioned, QB +2, 1. So one thing you can do here is just set this to 100, right? Minimum exposure of this stack type as 100%. And then you will get, we'll have to adjust 2 projections here, but you'll get lineups that are all QB +2, 1, right? So that's one way to do it. But probably the better way, if you're totally dead set on having this particular roster construction, is to just set a stacking rule for it. And you can set an advanced stacking rule here and say positions, we have 1 QB. I would say probably you would probably want to do it to include running backs in the stack. You would say 2, right? 1 QB, 2 either running back, wide receiver, or tight ends. And then on the opposing team, we want typically probably a wide receiver or a tight end run back, right? Actually, you know what? It's probably just fine to do this as well and let correlation make sure that you don't get uncorrelated players together. So something like this would probably work. And then this is going to force the rule in the build. So in this case, we won't even in the entire pool of 500, we're not going to get other kinds of lineups here. So we'll see what we'll see what comes out on the other side of this, and then we'll go through it there. So Just a second. We'll let this build finish up. Always a good opportunity for me to catch my breath. I get enthusiastic and excited when I'm answering questions, especially talking about ownership, as we have been today. There is one other. I had one other question that I was going to talk about today on stream here regarding ownership. So we'll get to that here. But anyway, we don't need to finish the rest of the build. We can see here now our entire pool of 440 is going to be built with that particular roster construction. Oh, interesting. I think this probably came up because I stopped the build here. Oh, no. This is actually good. We've got a Nick Boyle problem. So I'll figure out what's going on here. The builder seems to think that Nick Boyle plays for a different team than he does, which might also explain why he's being projected the wrong way. So that's actually a good find. Let me grab this build here because that may help us figure out what's going on. So, but anyway, long story short, the more kind of full way to make sure you get the right kinds of stack types that you're looking for is to set the rule, and then 100% of your pool will have it. So, all right, let's keep it rolling. Cody says, haha, Nick Boyle is clearly going off. Yeah, we'll see about that. Is he even on the Ravens? Like, now that we have this, now that I saw this issue presented this way, where he's showing up, like, I'm curious if he's even on the team or what. But, all right, let's see. Let's jump to this next question from Joseph. I understand that continuing to enter high upside lineups will result in a big hit at some point. When would you suggest that a player start entering higher stakes contests / using more bankroll for entries? For the NBA, I've been playing 150, 20, 3 max plus 2 single entries totaling $18.50. My bankroll is much greater than that, but I've not had a hit yet, like winning 2, 3, 4 plus times my entry fees. My 1% equity over my last 802 entries is, since December 3rd, is 1.81%, and I am minus $28 over those entries. This was calculated using Google Sheets. Okay, interesting question here overall. Quite a bit to unpack. I'm going to kind of handle this one at a time. So, first of all, as you actually get a bigger and bigger bankroll, I think what will generally end up happening most commonly is you'll actually end up playing less percentage of your bankroll over time. Part of the main reason for that is because the quality of the contests that you can play to get additional action down gets worse and worse. So when we say play 5% of your bankroll per night, for example, a lot of that is with the assumption that you are playing a unique lineup in every single contest and playing contests that grade out extremely well from an effective entrance and payout structure standpoint, right? You're playing the 20 max quarter jukebox and dollar, and you're playing single entries, the $1, the $3, the $5. Maybe you're playing some 3 maxes, right? All these contests that grade out well. But if you had a $50,000 bankroll and you wanted to get $1,500, $1,000, $2,000 of action down on a slate, that money has to go to contests that are much sharper and you're going to have a lower ROI in. At that point, typically you end up playing less. So the answer here, right, of like, when would I suggest that a player start entering? These are two different questions. When would I suggest that a player start entering higher stakes contests is only once you are basically playing all the lower stakes contests leading up to it. There's not really a jump that I would ever personally recommend you make where you say, I don't play $5 contests anymore, because most of the time the $5 contests are very good. They're very soft, right? And I would never recommend you just jump. Now I only play $100 contests, right? You pretty much play these lower stakes contests as long as you can until you get removed from them because of DraftKings or FanDuel's restrictions. And then in terms of using more bankroll for entries, I mean, you will, of your absolute value, right? You will use more bankroll as your bankroll grows. If you're playing 5% of your bankroll with a $500 roll, right? You will play more if that bankroll becomes a $2,000 roll. But in actuality, by percentage, your investment will probably go down over time, or it should, because the quality of the contest that you can get into as you become a higher stakes player gets worse. So it never really becomes more, at least relatively speaking. From your contest selection standpoint, you've been playing $150, $20 3 max and 2 single entries totaling $18.50. I imagine this looks like FanDuel because I play often a similar contest mix. This looks probably like a FanDuel. So like the 5 cent, the 25 cent, the $1, and maybe the $2 single entries or something like that. Says I have not had a hit yet. And then your top 1% equity, it's great that you're tracking this, is 1.81%. In NBA, it can be a little bit harder to have a sky high top 1% equity. A lot of times what ends up happening is that you just are positive over the profitable payout positions, but having a very high top 1% equity is difficult. That said, 1.81% is great, is very good, even over a small sample size. Right, that is a spectacular top 1% equity, I think, and especially in a sport like NBA that is lower variance and it's harder to have like a very high thing. And I would say, I mean, it looks like you said since December 3rd, so we're only talking about 6 days, but that's great. And despite the fact that you are negative, I wouldn't sweat that. I would say your process is probably working. I would say I would not be surprised if that 1% equity comes down and settles into somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5, depending on what your process looks like, of course. But your ROI should recover from that and kind of reacclimate, reset a bit there and settle in. I mean, just a way of thinking about this, right? If you're playing that piggy bank shot, right? Like top 1% is 0.01 times, it's roughly 275,000 people. Right. So we're talking about you're finishing somewhere in the top 2750 in that contest. And then if we go look at that contest, right. So what I'm saying is that anytime you have a lineup in the top 1% in that piggy bank shot, if you're doing that, it is finishing in the top 2750, which means you're getting approximately paid out like not very much, right? Like you may be getting rewarded very little for that lineup. Where is it? And you're competing against me. I'm taking up all the money. 2750 is right. Like you may be just 4xing, right, and making a cool 20 cents, 25 cents, right, which isn't very much. So you can play this a lot, have top 1% equity, finish in the top 1%, and not get paid out very well. So it takes a while to kind of realize that. So I would say. Like this contest is so big. It's enormous, right? And then if you look at like the dribbler, right? This is a contest that's 7,000 people. I've been doing more of kind of a ranked fill approach with these contests on FanDuel when I'm playing them, because I like a lineup that might be in the top 1% and make you 50 cents in the piggy bank shot is like probably maybe a top 10 finish in the dribbler. I have been sacrificing a little bit of variance, or I've been accepting a little bit more variance on when I'm playing on FanDuel to rank fill my contests, to maximize my outcome, to maximize my ROI when I have good lineups. So I would consider doing that too, right? Like with 150 lineups, and also especially if you're just playing like $18, right? $15, something like that. I think it's okay eating a little bit additional variance to capitalize on upside. And especially, I mean, again, if you track your top 1% equity over the next month, and by the end of December or something like that, you have 1.6% of your lineups in the top 1%. At that point, I think that's a decent size sample to validate your process. And I would say, like, don't go crazy. You're not all of a sudden trying to like go bust, but at that point you could probably afford to rank fill your lineups, double down on your best lineups in your pool, and actually give yourself the chance at a little bit more real upside when you have a good lineup. So, Aaron, sorry, this was pretty quick. I see quick question, and it is a quick question. So thank you for being patient here. In your opinion, when is it not a good time to late swap? I would say you're unlikely to ever really make your lineups much worse late swapping. I wouldn't look for reasons not to late swap. If a player is now into the starting lineup and they weren't going to start before, if a player got ruled out, it's almost always a good time to late swap. With that said, I think if nothing really changes at all, sometime there can be a sim that runs that changes a player's projection by like a minute, and it updates the timestamp and it makes it look like projections have changed here. But it really hasn't. In that particular case, I think you could maybe slightly, I don't even want to say degrade your lineups. You can make your lineups maybe a little bit higher risk or a little more variant by late swapping, purely because of the fact that when you swap, we just rebuild each lineup once. And in the original build, your set of 20 or 150 lineups are a part or were the best ones of a much bigger set. So typically, I'll tell you what I do. Here's what I do. I use the basketball monster and I go to this player news tab. And if there is an update here since the last time I made an adjustment, something that has changed for a player playing in the game that night, right? I swap. Provided that the projections on SaberSim have also changed. But if the projections have changed, if the sims have run, right, and you see the notification that a sim ran, but there's not really any news, there's not really any reason that apparently something would change, I sometimes just leave it alone. But with all that said, if you're confused, if you're like, oh man, I watched Jordan's office hours and now I don't know whether to swap, always there on the side of swapping rather than not. Right. The other night on Tuesday, before the Lakers game, Dwight Howard was not starting. Right. And a sim ran, and I actually went to Basketball Monster and saw, I think it was Taylor Horton Tucker that went into the lineup. Oh no, it was Avery Bradley into the lineup, Dwight Howard out. That actually had like a decent impact on the projections. Especially it boosted AD a little bit, but it actually ended up boosting Taylor Horton Tucker quite a bit because his rebounding rates go up when Dwight Howard's not on the floor. And I ended up actually getting onto quite a bit of THT and had a decent night overall, but would probably, like, I don't know. I would have never really guessed that had an impact. And even considered just being, it was the last game of the night on a 3-game slate. I was like, but I checked here and it said somebody else is starting than we expected, and Sims ran, and it ended up being a nice move. So I would always swap, even if you're like, that doesn't seem that important. If you can name why the sim is running, if you can see from some kind of news, like even if it's because Avery Bradley is starting over Dwight Howard, it's a good idea to do it, I think. So Nancy Drew Guy says, when did you guys get a partnership with RunPure Sports? As of today. So both sides are pretty excited about that. We are now their optimizer of choice, or optimizer add-on. So, but that is as of today. Don says, seems like hitting high-end scores in NBA DFS is harder on FanDuel because they went multi-positional. Any thoughts to changing roster construction approach on SaberSim as a consequence? Interesting. I have heard competing opinions about this from different sharp people. And I am not entirely sure where I stand. I think in general, I think on one side, multi-positional eligibility adds an additional variable, right? And it adds complexity to the game. And in general, I think when you add complexity to games, they become harder to solve, and the skill gap between the worst player and the best player becomes greater. I also think in DFS, when you have multi-positional eligibility, the need to make sure that you are playing the best plays becomes higher, and the sharpest players in the fields will even have more exposure to the best overall plays on the slate because there is more flexibility in how they are used. But I think that the caveat to that is that multi-positional flexibility in some ways can make the game a little bit harder to exploit, right? Especially from a roster construction standpoint. Like, one of the things I used to love to do on FanDuel, and now it's pretty hard, is to do things like study where the chalk is, right? Like where is the value? Where are most of the best plays positionally? What salary bands are they at, right? So like 3-game slate tonight, not the best example, but if we go back to last night, right? Like, let's go back to last night again. Like, one of the things I used to like to do, and I think this is just hard to do now, to be honest, or less effective, was to look at, here, let me see here, was to look at like this and see, let's put everybody back in the pool. and you could see, so for example, maybe that most of the value plays were at center, right? Or the two best value plays were at center. There was good value at like the shooting guard, small forward. It's a big slate last night and a lot of diversity, but right, like especially before lock, Dennis Smith was a play that opened up after lock. So maybe you say like, right, like maybe at point guard, a lot of people are going to pay up at point guard because of where the values opened up. So maybe you go to center, right, and pay up at center. But now, I mean, you can even see it when I'm trying to give the example here. Now that there's multi-positional flexibility, it's harder to do because players can be used in more spots. And I used to think that it was easier to exploit roster construction before on FanDuel when there wasn't multi-positional flexibility because you could identify what the most chalky constructions were a lot easier, just seeing where the value was. So I don't know, Don, if there's an answer of like what I would say that you could do to exploit this better in FanDuel, or not even, I don't even know if it's necessarily FanDuel because they're both multi-positional now. In SaberSim, I still think it's an interesting idea. I think it was easier before. I think it was easier to exploit before, but I think it actually makes the game softer now. I think it's my take. Now that I've talked through it, I think that's my take. But when they came out with this, there were people, I saw people on Twitter on both sides of this that were like, this is good, this is bad, this is better for good players, this is worse for good players. And I think it makes the game a little bit more complex, which does widen the skill gap, but I do think it makes it harder to exploit roster construction on a slate-to-slate basis when you're building lineups than it used to be. Like it used to be a relatively straightforward to just like identify the couple of positions where most of the value plays were and just make sure that of the best overall projected plays at those positions that you were over the field on them. And now you can't always do that as much. So, but okay. I missed this comment earlier. Cody said, this is why Jordan says rules are bad. I think I remember seeing this come in. I must have been talking about late swapping. I mean, yeah, on the late swap front, right? Like talking about relaxing salary and removing player filters and things like that to allow the late swap to come through. That's relatively simple. Imagine somebody that has set 40 player groups and has completely doctored up their traditional optimizer to try to get good lineups out of it. Has to do when they're late swapping in NBA, right? It's chaos. And then you do it again 30 minutes later. So bit of a mess there, but 6, I think you're running into a bug here. Not sure what's going on. Pool size is 0 after building lineups. We're working on fixing this. In the meantime, yeah, so you said logged out and back in and it's fixed. That works. Typically hard refreshing, Control-Shift-R will fix it as well. It's like a front end bug where the lineups actually exist. I don't think anybody cares about this. The lineups exist in the back end, but the front end doesn't get them quick enough for when the page refreshes. So if you refresh it a couple times, it will give the browser more time, more chances at going and getting those lineups. So if you're seeing this, refresh or log out and log back in, they'll probably be there. And we are working on a permanent fix right now. It is actually quite a technical conundrum. Or not conundrum, but quite a technical lift for us to fix this. So that's why it's taken some time. But 6 says, is ownership projection specific for the build or is it blanket ownership projection for 150? It's a blanket ownership projection for a large field GPP. So imagine the Minimax or the flagship contest that night on DraftKings or FanDuel, the flagship 150 max. So yeah, ownership will condense more at smaller fields. 6 said, curious so that I can adjust according to leverage listed or if I need to approach it from a different angle if I'm using 150 projected ownership to leverage a 20 max contest. Yeah, I think 20 maxes and 150s are going to play a little bit closer to each other. I don't know. I don't think ownership is going to differ significantly there. They could, but definitely for like single entry versus 150, right? Like if we go over to DraftKings, let's look at the showdown contest for tonight. And okay, so this is off because Cook, it sounds like, is playing. But let's just say, for example, that Justin Jefferson and Najee Harris are the chalkiest captains, right? After the Madison one goes away. If they're 18% in large field, right, it might be 30 in a single entry. So if you're making a determination that the optimal ownership of Jefferson is like 25%, right? That could be a player that you want to be over the field on in large field, but under the field on in your single entries because of the condensing of ownership. But you also need to be right that that's where the ownership condenses. And that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, right? If Najee Harris is actually the chalkiest play, the favorite captain, which he could be, and he actually is 20% in large field, and Justin Jefferson is 15% in large field, then Najee Harris might be 30% in single entry, but that ownership has to come from somewhere, and Justin Jefferson might actually be 10% in single entry. So identifying where the field is going to condense upon in your single entry contests and smaller field contests is kind of hard. And I think it's wise to think about, because if you think about it and at least have a stance, right, you can exploit it. But you should also be prepared to be wrong about that sometimes, right? Like when you are playing in that way and really trying to exploit ownership on a per contest basis, you are going to have a higher expected value when you are right, but you are also going to be wrong a little more often, right? Like you could approach this contest tonight and just say, I'm going to play mostly just the best plays without caring about ownership too much, and make sure that I have the exposure to certain captains in approximately the rate at which they are optimal in the Sims. And playing like that is going to be fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You'll probably be a profitable player, right? But you could maximize your expected value if you could identify exactly how much the field was going to do certain things in a per contest basis. However, unless you are perfect on that, you are going to sacrifice on a slate-to-slate basis some expected value by potentially being wrong, right? Like you could say, even if Justin Jefferson's actual percent chance of being optimal is 25%, 30%, for example, right? If you project that he is going to be 10% owned at captain in the contest that you're playing, so you end up playing him at 60% of your lineups in captain to exploit the inefficiency in the ownership. Well, if he comes in at 40% owned at captain, just as an example, then suddenly your strategy is actually probably suboptimal. You should have been under that. So that's kind of the risk. Playing exploitatively. Man, I'm all jumbled up now. Is a little bit of a higher risk strategy for that reason, mostly because you can be wrong. But if you had just played the optimal strategy there, right, you can't really be as wrong in that state because you're kind of matching his chance of being optimal there. So anyway, I think it's interesting. I think it's really sharp. There are players that do this very well, that are like, and target specific contests for which to do this, and say like, I target high stakes single entry because people play it suboptimally, and I can identify how it's played suboptimally, at least more often than not, right? People will just throw their cash lineup into $100 single entry, and I crush in that contest because I know what the cash lineups will look like, and I know what players are going to be over-owned relative to their expectation. So I specifically build a lineup to exploit that. But if you were wrong, then you're just building some lineup that just sucks by comparison to what would have just been a good lineup to have played in the first place. So that's kind of the balance there overall. But hopefully that helps. I feel like I took that in a little bit of a different direction. The original question that was written here was, are the ownership projections for large field or small field, and do they change? And the answer is they're for large field, wide contests, and no, they don't change. You need to think about that for yourself. So Joseph said, hey, Jordan, can you go over the leverage percent in the research builds and when to not get too crazy removing players? I had Justin Jefferson and Kittle around -8% and Gibson over 10, faded all of them. Yeah, it's a little bit up to you. I'm not going to be able to give you a one-size-fits-all here. But let's do a research build for fun for last week's slate, because we have weird Nick Boyle projections, unfortunately, for this week's slate at the moment. See what we get. So a few things that it really depends heavily on is your individual risk tolerance, and also how many lineups you're playing. And I would say probably the last one is your contests that you are playing themselves, like the individual contests you are playing. Let me talk about, let me make sure that this build gets off the ground here, and then we'll talk about, yeah, okay. So we'll talk about why those things are important. The first one is your individual risk tolerance. You may tell me that a 100% fade of a 35% owned, well-projected running back like Gibson is okay for you. I might tell you I'm only comfortable going half the field on that play, right? We're under on both. We've made the same determination on that the field is over-owning this player and that there's leverage on fading them. But what we are comfortable with our own individual risk tolerance is different between the two of us, right? So that's a risk tolerance assessment. Some of that also comes down to the number of lineups you are playing, right? I might be playing 150 lineups and you might be playing 20 lineups. So you play 20 and fade Gibson and you have 0 of 20 that have Gibson. And I may be 1/3 the field on Gibson and I may play, I may be 1/3 the field on Gibson, but still have almost 20 lineups with him in it, right? And while percentages are great, at the end of the day, in some ways, you have to consider the actual raw lineups you are playing and like how many actual lineups do you want with this player in it, right? And I see you said low stakes, large field GPP 150 max. Yeah, which is great. I guess what I should have said is like even knowing the contest that you are playing doesn't necessarily let me answer the question for you. But the point is that you may want to think in terms of raw lineups and not just you may want to think in terms of number of lineups that you're fading the player and not just percentage. The final one, and I'm glad you mentioned low stakes, is stakes, right? Like when we're looking at research builds, we are somewhat assuming that the field is going to play optimally, or we're making a kind of general, right? Like the builder is assuming that the field's going to play optimally when it projects ownership. But at different stakes, they may not, right? So put another way, there is error in the ownership projections. And if the ownership projections are wrong because the field doesn't find a good play, right, then we may be wrong, right? Like, yeah, sure, it's easy to say I want to fade Austin Eckler because he's going to be over-owned according to what we think the optimal ownership is for an aggregate. If he comes in at 20% ownership instead, well, then there was actually no benefit to fading him. So overall, how to use a research build and kind of make right decisions from it. Typically what I like to do is I like to focus more on, obviously I like to focus on the plays where the leverage is the highest or the lowest, right? The most negative or the most positive, right? But I think plays where the ownership projection is higher to begin with are better overall fades, right? Like if you were to ask me, would I be more confident in an Eckler fade or a Metcalf fade? I would probably be more confident in an Eckler fade, even though their leverage is approximately the same, right? Because let's say both of these ownership projections are plus or minus 5 either direction, right? If DK Metcalf's actual ownership comes in at 14%, well, then I don't even know if I would have bothered to have fade at all. But if Austin Eckler's ownership projection comes in at 25%, right, it's still probably the right side to be on. A lot of times what I like to do is ask myself, how low do I think his ownership projection could actually get? How low do I think his actual ownership could be? And if it was that, would I still want to fade, right? You can do it the other way around too with positive, right? So like this case, we should play Travis Kelce, right? And this checks with our intuition too, especially on a Foster Moreau slate, right? How high would Travis Kelce's ownership have to get for me to want to not be over the field on him? Well, it would be about 19%. I think that's probably about as high as it would go. So I want to play some Travis Kelce. But then in terms of what you actually do on a practical level from there, sorry, I should change this back so people know what we're talking about. It's ultimately up to you, right? So typically, like I generally more take the stance on coming in half the field instead of full fades most of the time, unless there's like a big inefficiency, right? So I think once you start talking about -10, I think it gets kind of interesting. Like I might consider a full fade of Jacobs, right? But a lot of times I prefer to just take some of these players and come in half the field instead. The last other thing that it depends on is like how much does the builder want to give of these guys to you anyway, right? So here, let me do this. Let me take a quick screenshot so I can remember these guys' names because I will forget. But like one thing you can do is like, so maybe you grab your six names or whatever here. So we're thinking that the guys that we are considering fading is Jacobs, Eckler, Metcalf. Maybe those are like our 3, right? Those are our fades. So then when we go to actually building our lineups, we can go here and like see how much you're actually getting, right? If we come in with 5% Metcalf in our pool of 20, then maybe we just cut him out, get a little bit of additional leverage on the field there. But if we're over the field on Austin Eckler and our research build told us to be under the field, well, then maybe we settle in on a middle ground and match the field, or maybe we are only half the field instead of doing a full fade, right? But some of this is your own personal risk tolerance. How much are you comfortable taking a stand on here? The builder is going to tell you any of this, all in the above is fine, right? All of the above is fine here up until a certain point, right? Like we could come in here and like look at, like, let's look. So he could come in here and say, okay, my fades were Eckler, gone. Jacobs, didn't even have any to begin with. Metcalf, didn't even have any to begin with. Okay, so in this particular case, wasn't that big of a deal, right? But maybe our fades were also, okay, so then maybe, you know, we liked Kelsey, so maybe we lock Kelsey, right? And who else is like super chalky? Maybe we fade Fournette too, right? Like maybe these were our fades that were coming up in the research builds, right? This is an aggressive stance, but there's still 20 profitable lineups in our pool of 500 that follow it. We're just playing aggressively. We're fading, of the 5 highest owned plays on the entire slate, we're completely fading 4 of them. We have a player locked into our lineup. We have a tight end locked in. We're playing 80% of one stack, right? Like this is aggressive, but it's fine for the contest, right? But it's risky. So it's kind of a personal risk tolerance choice of how much leverage on the field do you want to feel comfortable. So, but my personal approach, if you want, I know sometimes I ask these questions, I want to try to give you as much information as possible. But then if we come around and say, just tell me what to do, just tell me what you do. What I do is I prefer to think about things mostly in terms of getting half of the field or twice the field, 2x the field. But that's also because I'm playing 150 lineups most of the time. So when I have 150 lineups to work with, it's a all right. Well, I'm back. Hopefully I didn't lose all you guys. Classic internet blip. It is driving me absolutely mad here. Starting to bother me. Sorry about that. Maybe we'll need to give a call to Comcast. I get in a zone with these questions. I'm ripping. I'm feeling good. And then it's like internet blips. So anyway, I'll wrap this one up. What I was saying is that if you want my personal take, what I choose to do with these is because I'm playing 150 lineups most of the time. I like to think about it in terms of getting half the field or 2x the field, whether I like or dislike the play. Crossing out a player completely in 150 lineups, especially for a player that is well projected overall, but is just also highly owned, is a very aggressive stance. And I don't like to take that aggressive of a stance. So Brandon says, is someone getting more serious about DFS and not knowing much outside of what I've been learning on SaberSim? What are some good sources to research and influence can I bring into SaberSim to differentiate further? I mean, I know you said outside of SaberSim. I would definitely say, if you haven't already, to watch the courses on our YouTube channel for the sports that you're playing. We put a lot of thought into those, and I think that's a really good starting point. One thing that I think can be very helpful as you're just getting a feeling for how the game plays out is to watch other content creators, especially to get an idea of what the field is thinking about for a slate, right? Al Zeidenfeld and Sal Vetri and Joe Holka and these guys all do free videos on YouTube every week where they break down slates. And especially if you're new and you don't have a intuition about who's going to be chalky or why the popular plays are the popular plays, I think that can be a very good approach of learning how to identify those things. And that can be pretty helpful to see that, right? Our videos, our courses on YouTube are evergreen, and they're intended to teach you how to think about the concepts of NFL DFS or NBA DFS or baseball DFS. And they're great. And I highly recommend watching those. But one thing that can help is to get a sense of intuition about actually who the best plays are on the slate and why. Not so that you can rush over to SaberSim and lock them all in and jam them all in, but so you can learn what the field is going to do and learn, right? Like, it doesn't really mean that much to just look at your lineups and see, hey, these are the guys that are in the lineups, without being able to quantify that by saying, oh, okay, like, who's not in this lineup, right? Like, I can just look at this because I have a good sense of intuition and immediately say this lineup is leveraging Brady stacks by playing Fournette with a low-owned stack, right? Taysom Hill with Traquan Smith and Ty Montgomery is going to be a pretty low-owned stack using Fournette, who potentially stands to gain if the Brady stack fails, right? Like, I have a sense of this, right? But you kind of would have to be able to tell Brady and Buck stacks are popular this week. Saints stacks are not, and like get a sense of what the slate's looking like. And I think watching creators that have specific week to week or slate to slate content can help to do that. But only answered that way because you pressed me on it and saying, oh, you didn't. I just read it wrong. No, not knowing much outside of what I've been learning on SaberSim. Well, still, I guess that works. It's a really good tool to learn how to think about the slates and what other people are thinking about. So, 6 says, is there a max salary for NFL single game that you or anyone at SaberSim might recommend or had a higher ROI when using? Not sure if there have been any sort of mocks or research done in the past to support a known value. I like to drop mine. It depends on the contest again, right? Like, everything always depends on the contest. In a single entry, you may only need to drop it like I think by default all of our single games are dropped 100, right? Your chance of getting duplicated in these contests is a lot lower the lower number of lineups are in the contest, right? It might be just, if you're playing single entry, it might be fine just where it is. I a lot of times use something like this. I'll just tell you that. I like something like this. I think it's a good balance of not sacrificing too much raw expectation, while also lowering your chance of getting duplicated a fair bit. At least it feels that way. You can still build really chalky lineups at 49.5, but that's where I like to settle in. So. Cool. All right. I'm gonna wrap up. I think that's the last question I have right now. If you guys have another question, feel free to shout it out. Fine with that. But I want to wrap up the stream here today with one more question here. And this is from Pippin. And he and I went back and forth a little bit last night talking about this. But we'll talk about this real quick because I think this is a fun way to leave it. This is a very theoretical question. And we've been talking about ownership all day today here anyway, so it's a good one to stop on. He said, let's say you have near perfect ownership. And actually, you know what? For the thought experiment, I think it's more interesting to say, let's say we have perfect ownership. What would be the correct way to account for that in terms of the builder? Would you max ownership fade and leave it at the back-tested settings? How would you recommend going about it? And this is a really interesting question because talk constantly about how the sliders for your particular contest are back-tested, right? And they are. And typically recommend, unless you have some reason to do it, leaving these alone because they've been back-tested, right? Well, it gets interesting when you start thinking about what if you have perfect ownership projections, because they're back tested. The ownership fade slider is not back tested against perfect ownership projections, because nobody has perfect ownership projections before the slate starts, no matter where you're going, right? They're back tested against our ownership projections, right? So we make a determination of how much ownership fade is appropriate to have, knowing that, oh, there's a bot in my chat. Get out of your bot. Blocked. We make a determination about how much ownership fade is appropriate, knowing that the ownership projections aren't themselves perfect. But if they were perfect, what would we do? And my gut feeling here, and again, I think this is just a thought experiment. I actually don't know how much practical is about this. But it's fun to talk about. And let me know too, you guys watching, if you have thoughts on this. But my gut feeling is that it probably makes sense to increase the ownership fade slider, right? Like any reasons why the ownership fade slider might be lower, if the ownership projections were higher, right? We could, or were better, we could exploit it a little more aggressively, right? That was my first inclination. But I don't think necessarily that it should go to 10, right? Not all slopes are lines, in the wise words of Jordan Ellenberg. Just because pushing it higher doesn't mean maxing it out is optimal. But it's an interesting thought experiment. I think that the problem too is, like, we are assuming the ownership projections just get more accurate, like if you were perfect, but there's also another variable of how exploitable are those projections anyway? How efficient is the ownership? Like, what if your ownership projections were highly efficient and perfectly matched the chance of a player being optimal? And even better, if you knew somehow for a fact that you had perfect ownership projections, it almost at that point would make more sense to just perfectly match the field on every individual player, because your projections would not be perfect. If you knew you had perfect information from the ownership and imperfect information from projections, it almost feels like it would make more sense to turn ownership fade off at that point and make no effort to fade the field, and to just match the field perfectly and rely on your constructions to do most of the work for you. Total theory, just something that was a very fun conversation that Pippin and I were having last night. Curious, feel free to chime in as well if you guys have thoughts on the Office Hours channel in Slack. I love this kind of weird theory stuff about the game. I guess it's game theory at its core, right? Of thinking about how to think about this stuff. I do think even if there's not a practical conclusion that comes out of this, thinking about the game in this way will make you a better player. And doing these thought experiments and things like that. So does get fun, but let's see. Anyway, we'll take this one other question here. And we'll call it a day. This is from Sharpshooter, and it looks like he's got a live final ticket for next weekend. So congratulations, Sharpshooter. 200 people contest asking for a friend. Yeah, live final strategy. I haven't actually played in a live final. So you're asking somebody I admittedly hasn't played in one, but I have a pretty strong sense of, how they play, just being around this. You're going to be playing, it's a small field tournament, but amongst people that are going to be playing it pretty sharply. I think if you were to just start as a starting point, right? Maybe single entry works here, and you've got 200 people, right? Like what the sliders are implying here is obviously you want to correlate your lineup. You want to build stacks to essentially ignore ownership, and then to embrace some level of variance, right? To allow variance to differentiate you enough in the field rather than explicitly trying to fade ownership. I actually think this is somewhat wise. I think if I were playing in a contest like this, I think it would be actually pretty hard to identify what the field is going to do, because they are going to play many of the best plays. But a common thing that happens in these live finals is you have a lot of people all pivot off of the same play and onto the same other play. I would say as you're building your lineup and as you're studying the slate, I would look for situations where there is a relatively chalky play, whether it's a value play or a stud or something like that, that projects similarly to other plays around them, and it might be a situation where the field is all going to jump ship onto the same other play in an effort to do something different. I don't know. I think if I were building a lineup for one of these things, I would not be overly concerned with differentiating, with intentionally fading ownership. Obviously, you want to differentiate, but I think just embracing some natural variance might get you there close enough. And I think it is very easy to sacrifice projected points, raw projection in the name of fading ownership, and then the cards get flipped over and you manage to do nothing at all. You have the exact same ownership as you would have gotten the other way and sacrificed projection for no reason. That is what I would be cautious of doing, especially in a field this small anyway. You don't actually stand to gain too much by playing very low owned plays, and you can get low owned plays purely by almost chance because you embraced some amount of variance in a way that the field didn't. That's the way I would think about it. But if you somehow are able to get an edge and get a read on what you think that the field is going to do, right? Then I think it gets interesting about making a pivot and maybe even potentially like negatively correlating against the pivot, right? Like the slate at the moment, I haven't studied it too much, but it definitely feels like it's going in the direction of Chief stacks with Eckler. Yeah, right? I think, maybe Brady stacks are interesting too. But that's what it like feels like at the moment. Oh, it's week 15. It's next week. Okay. Yeah, so then we can't even look at projections or anything yet. So I don't know. I think they're tough. It's tricky because you're playing small field contests with sharp people, and you like when everybody else is just trying to exploit each other, right? And you get this like weird feedback loop of like ownership ending up kind of becoming a little bit non-predictable because you know that the field is all going to try to exploit everybody else playing in the contest. I think sometimes it makes, I guess here's my summary. I think sometimes it might make more sense to just play in an optimal strategy where I'm not saying play a cash lineup, but you build a lineup that's correlated, that's built for upside, that maximizes its upside and like maybe even its average outcome. And try to not get stuck in a situation where you try to exploit ownership that doesn't end up being there. But have fun with it for sure. I think it's an interesting thought experiment there. But cool. Let's see. I think we will. Yep, we will. We'll call it there. It was a fun stream today. Thank you to everybody that tuned in, and thank you, of course, to everybody that watches this after the fact. Had plenty of interesting discussion here about ownership. Late swap, some very relevant topics after the slate yesterday. As always, we will be back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, for Friday's stream. Until then, good luck on Thursday Night Football. Good luck in your 3-game NBA slate here, and good luck if you are playing any hockey DFS, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow. See ya.